Over to you, Mark.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name's Mark Coughlin. I'm the Global Advisory Leader for Power and Utilities for PwC. Looking at you and speaking to you from Melbourne in Australia. It's getting a little bit late in the evening here, in the middle of winter here in Melbourne. So, but welcome to you all. We've got quite a number of people from around the world with us today for this conversation around the role of transmission companies in the energy transition, and PwC and the World Energy Council are very pleased to be bringing it to you today. I might just move to the next slide. I'll just do a few introductory comments, and just to let you know who we're joined by today. So we've got a very distinguished group of speakers with us for the conversation today. We'll be hearing from Dr. Angela Wilkinson, the Secretary General and CEO of the World Energy Council, Martin Young, the Senior Director of Insights from the World Energy Council, and one of my colleagues from the Netherlands, Jeroen van Hoof, our Global Power and Utilities Leader from PwC. Also joining us from Europe is Dr. Paul Nilsson, one of our other partners from the Netherlands, from PwC in the Netherlands. Chris Peters, the CEO of the Elia Group. Mr. Ahmed Al-Ibrahim, the CEO of GCC Interconnection Authority. And Mr. Andreas Kuhlmann, the CEO of Transelec. Really looking forward to today's conversation and with a very, very distinguished group of speakers. Pauline, can you maybe move to the next slide, please? So we will just work our way through a fairly traditional format. I'll hand over to Dr. Wilkinson shortly to give us the context of the study, then we'll move on to the high-level results of the brief. Then we'll have a panel discussion. We will keep everyone on mute for that discussion besides the panelists, and we really welcome your questions through the Q&A function, which I'll refer to shortly, and then we'll wrap up at the end. So I think we'll always be tight on time. We never can quite have enough time for these things, particularly with the number of questions I'm sure we'll get through. From a housekeeping point of view, as you can see there, please send your written questions through the Q&A option at any time during the webinar. And Pauline and the organising team will send those through to me so that I can make sure I can see them, and we'll refer to them through the Q&A part of the session. We will have a couple of sections where we'll be looking for polls, so please participate in those poll questions when they pop up on your screen. And if you've got any technical issues, please use the chat option for any sound issues or you can't see the presentation, etc. So with that, I will hand over to Dr. Wilkinson to give us the welcome to this session. Thanks, Dr. Wilkinson. I think we've.
Angela, you're self-muted.
Okay, I would like to do a little scene setter today as we welcome everybody to this call. Thank you. And one of the jobs, I think, of the World Energy Council is to help try and put these types of initiatives into the bigger context. And of course, you know, the future of the grid, of course it matters to transmission system operators. They operate the grid around the world, and today we're joined by people who operate the large majority of all the infrastructure in place today. But of course, the future of the grid matters to all of us because it's about the future of electrification. And I'd like to just talk a little bit about how do we put that into context of this thing called the global energy transition? And how do we understand not to confuse the terms energy and electrification and what's going on around the total bigger picture? First slide, please. It seems really strange, but only 9 months ago, we were at the 24th World Energy Congress in Abu Dhabi and talking about the future developments of the energy world. And we were talking about our world energy scenarios to 2040 at that time, and looking at the reality that nobody can predict the future of energy, but we can, using scenarios, try and get a feel for what are the different global energy transition pathways, and what does that mean about the relative mix of energy whether it's power, whether it's fuels, whether it's heat. And what does that mean in terms of the running and the progression of the grid, which supports the development of what we call the power revolution that's going on globally. And today, 20% of the world energy system it comes from the electrification. And according to our scenarios, which focused on innovation pathways, we estimate that between 28 and 31% of the world energy mix might come from electrification by 2040. That still leaves 70% of the world's energy needs being met from other sources. But I want to clarify that we're not talking about 100% electrification by 2040. And of that electrification, we're not talking about 100% renewable electrification by 2040 either. We're saying that that renewables will take an increasing share of the electricity system and that they are growing very fast, but that there will still be the requirement for hydro and nuclear and other sources for creating power by 2040. So the future of the grid is important because it is part of the global power revolution, which is part of the global energy transition. Next slide, please. But even as we anticipate we are going to be using more electricity for more things over the coming decades, we also stand at this time of what we could call a brutal shock to the whole world in terms of the Covid-19 crisis. And this Covid crisis comes at a time of pre-existing tensions on the global energy system and the process of global energy transition. So even as this crisis impacts, it impacts on top of stresses where many energy companies were already anticipating global economic recession because of the sluggish growth of the global economy. It also comes at a time where climate change momentum was again increasing because we had seen a growth of emissions with energy use since 2018. Prior to that, we had started to see emissions dropping per unit of energy used. But since 2018, we've seen a recoupling of energy and the economy and climate change momentum. And perhaps the most undiscussed area of tension has been around the social tensions, that even as we try to accelerate global energy transition, we see the rise of social issues in many different countries around the world about who will pay for the higher cost of accelerating global energy transition, and how do we ensure that those costs are fairly shared across and between different countries as well as within them. So that we had a long-term outlook which was already uncertain, but definitely sees a role for the increasing electrification and a future of the grid. And we now have this moment of crisis, which is creating perfect storm conditions for increasing bankruptcy within the energy sector. And so I'm going to pass to Jeroen now, because this, if ever there was an opportune time to think about what is the future of those people who maintain, operate and design the electricity infrastructure, the grid, for a global power revolution, now is a good time. Jeroen, or back to, I think it's over to Jeroen, isn't it?
Yes, correct, Angela. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm Jeroen van Hoof. I lead our global power and utilities sector in PwC, and I'm happy to work with the World Energy Council in our innovation partnership, which is all focused around energy transition. And this study is just one of an example out of it. If we can move to the next slide. I'm cautious of the time here, and I want to take you to the discussion as soon as we can. But briefly setting out the study that we have conducted and building on what Angela already said, I would like to tell you a little bit about the context and the stakeholders which have been involved in this study. So we have interviewed 37 CEOs or high-placed individuals of TSOs or ICSOs in the past period. representing actually 4,500 kilometers of grid out of the total roughly 6,000. That is 2/3 of the global transmission network that were interviewed as part of the study. And I would say it gives a fair view on what's happening across the world in transmission. And this is an interesting thing, because despite transmission is yet still not a global business, it's a regional business, we see a lot of similarities across the globe. So if we move to the next slide, please. As Angela rightfully pointed out, this sector was already in transformation ahead of COVID-19. So what we see now, I think the elements that play an important role in this transformation were there. They were pushed by climate change, the need for decarbonization as a consequence, and clearly energy is a core element in that decarbonization agenda, affecting industry players, energy players and utilities, but also transmission companies. And if one thing which now becomes more clear and clear after the COVID or during the COVID-19 crisis is that probably the transformation will continue, and probably it will happen at a greater pace on average. Depends a little bit on the region where you're sitting. Continental Europe is different maybe than US and is different than Asia, but in general the forces that are pushing for this transformation are there and remain to be of interest, I would say increasing interest. People simply demand for this, so customers, and this is also what you see on this slide, being an active element of the electricity system and the power system, is something we have seen emerging because technology allowed it in the past few years. But I think we can expect that customers will increasingly push for transformation, have a different demand patterns, will come into the game as end users, not as passive off-takers of electricity, will bring their local generation as prosumers to the market. And we saw already pre the crisis that electric mobility was increasingly kicking in. So the electrification of end users, whether that be in industry, heat, mobility, is increasing, and demand response plays a role there. And because of automation, and that's the digitization component in this sheet, this is also all possible. So setting up smarter networks which are automated, actually serving as aggregation platforms to do balancing and employing AI was something which was not possible 10 years ago, but in today's world it is. If you add it up to the desire for a low carbon future, I think it is clear that transmission companies will play a role there. And if you think of about what Angela just said, whether that be on batteries coming to the system, enabling storage of electricity, industry actually partly electrifying, or fossils that are replaced by green molecules in the form of hydrogen, it all goes in the same direction. Electricity, and in particular green electricity, will play a more prominent role in the future system. Less centralized, more green, and focused on a low carbon future. Decentralization is I would say in large parts of the world already a fact. So rooftop solar, wind, etc. It's all actually bringing power closer to consumption. So moving from TSO, sort to say DSO, and how that all plays out in the system are important changes here. I will stop there. I will hand over to my colleague, Mr. Martin Young. He'll take it from here. So Martin, please, off you go.
Jeroen, thank you for setting that great context. I'm going to go through very quickly some of the high-level results of the study. To begin with, our interviews highlighted 5 common challenges that are being faced by transmission companies. Now, they may have been expressed differently, but they convey the same sentiments, and there's a high degree of overlap. The first of these is about maintaining reliability in an era of ever greater variable renewable generation and the challenges that brings. The second aspect was about the long-term planning. The challenges here about working with new actors and in novel scenarios and providing new services. The third point related to incorporating new technologies. This has obviously been a challenge that grid operators have always been dealing with, but there's more innovation at the moment, I think, and so that trying to incorporate this brings new operational challenges that need to be managed. Digitization has been picked up a little bit by Jeroen. It's clearly been accelerated during the current pandemic response. There's been some clarification of what's happening, but it's also raised some new uncertainties, and how companies deal with that needs to be bottomed out further. Finally, there's the access of geopolitics, interconnection and integration. Now, clearly, interconnection and integration are not the same thing as control, but it does flag some geopolitical concerns about that. Move on to the next slide. From these interviews, we distilled 4 recommendation areas. The first one was about a future focus, and that divides between having more sophisticated modelling with a much more fragmented grid for hourly, daily demand, but also having a greater focus on scenario planning to explore the alternative plausible futures. The second aspect was about ecosystem shaping. The energy transition, as we've heard, is clearly going to require increased electrification. Policymakers and regulators need to have expert technical input, and TSOs are ideally placed to be able to provide more active input into here about advising what's plausible, etc. And they also need to think about collaborating with new energy systems players, the new service providers, and how they can help shape the system. The next area was on license to operate. We have a rapidly changing society, and societal demands and expectations are shifting. It's absolutely imperative to be able to explain and demonstrate the social benefits that transmission infrastructure has to maintain its social license. And there's a need to engage with a broader host of stakeholders. And finally, transforming. The organisations need to build new capabilities, attract new skills and competencies, for example, in data science. There might also be some cultural evolution reflecting the broader societal change. Our strong sense from synthesizing the different interviews is that many of the companies are already engaged in these areas. And with that, I hand over to Mark. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks, Jeroen, and thanks, Angela, for your comments, which gives us a good sense about the findings from the analysis that's been done over the last few months. As I said at the outset, very excited to be leading this panel discussion over the next 30 or 35 minutes or thereabouts. I'd like to just give a quick rundown of our panelists, just so you're aware again, as I said at the beginning, they're quite an esteemed group, and just to give you a bit of a sense of their backgrounds. I'll just run through these in the order I have them in the bios sheet here, but Dr. Paul Nillison is a partner of mine from the Netherlands. He's a partner of strategy and our strategy function within PwC and leads the Dutch energy practice. He has over 20 years strategy consulting experience in global power and utilities. He recently advised the Dutch government on the future positioning and ownership structure of TenneT, the electricity TSO in the Netherlands and part of Germany. Paul was one of the co-authors of the WEC brief on transmission. He holds economics degrees with Edinburgh University and Oxford University and has a PhD in energy economics focused on electricity networks from Tilburg University. Then Mr. Andres Kuhlmann as the CEO of Transelec from Chile. Since March the 1st, 2007, Mr. Kuhlmann is CEO of Transelec, the leading power transmission company in Chile. From 2001 to 2007, Mr. Kuhlmann was the CEO of Siemens in Chile, and previously from 97 to 2001, he was the CEO of Electroandina SA, which is controlled by GDF Suez and Codelco, a leading electricity generating company in Chile. He was also Commercial and Operations VP at Edagel, controlled by Endesa, electricity generation company in Peru for 2 years, ending in 1996. He's a graduate in Civil and Industrial Engineering from the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile. He's also a very active member of his communities. He's a member of the Board of Trustees of the Engineering School of the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile and a council of SOFO FA, a federation of Chilean industry created in 1883. Mr. Chris Peters, the CEO of the Elia Group, Belgium and Germany, active in electricity transmission with subsidiaries in Belgium, Elia Transmission Belgium and Northeast Germany 50 Hertz. The group operates nearly 19,000 kilometres of high voltage connections that supply power to 30 million end users. As such, the group is one of Europe's top 5 transmission system operators. Elia is also part of the Nemo Link joint venture where it operates the first subsea electrical interconnector between Belgium and the United Kingdom. In addition to its activities as a transmission system operator in Belgium and Germany, Elia Group provides various consulting services to international customers throughout the world. Before joining Elia Group, Mr. Peters ran the business consulting activities of Schlumberger in Europe, Russia, Africa, and the Middle East. And prior to that, he spent 14 years with McKinsey, of 7 of which he was a partner specialising in the energy sector. And then finally, Mr. Ahmed Al Ibrahim is the CEO of GCCIA in the Gulf States. As the Chief Executive Officer, he's directly in charge of the GCC Interconnection Authority and its $1.5 billion 400 kV electricity supergrid interconnecting the power grids of the 6 GCC states, availing exchange and trade of electric power between the GCC states' national grids, in addition to their normal role of emergency support during grid incidents. He's been with the GCCIA for 12 years since he joined in 2007 as Director of Operations and Maintenance. His main role is leading the development of an efficient power market and providing knowledge excellence in power systems integration. That is a very, very strong set of CVs, and I thank you all for joining us on our call today. Now, the riskiest part of this whole session is as I start to turn to polling on the webinar, and then we turn to Q&A. So I'm relying on technology doing its thing here. So Pauline, can I call on you to flick up the poll question for us, please? And I just ask everyone to respond. We're looking for you to give us your priorities out in the audience on what would you like us to discuss here and now. So you're putting pressure on me and the panelists on your priorities. So please select one of the following, and Pauline will flick up the answers for us in a minute, and that will guide our discussion. All right, so we've got the results of the poll are on the screen. There's 2 distinct topics that we'll start with, and I'm sure we'll cover the other few as we go through them. But reliability in an era of renewables and long-term planning and working with new actors are the 2 major themes. And as I said, I'm sure we'll pick up on digital delivery, new technologies, and I'd be astounded if we don't touch on geopolitics and interconnectors as we go through this. So perhaps if I can just get in the normal way some comments from each of the panelists on these topics. I might start with reliability in the era of renewables. Paul Nillison, given you were involved in all of the interviews around the study, would love just to get a couple of your reflections first, and then I'll turn to the other panelists for other comments on reliability in this era of renewables.
Okay, Mark, thanks very much. I hope you can hear me. My camera isn't working, so you're just going to have to do with my voice. So thanks, everybody, and thank you also for the opportunity to speak. Yes, so in terms of reliability, the thing obviously that many of the players are talking about is the increased pressure on the resilience and reliability of the system as more intermittent renewables come onto the grid, and as sort of the controllable, dispatchable thermal sources disappear in certain markets and more wind and solar start to emerge, that it becomes harder to sort of manage the grid, and there's more sort of active grid management necessary, than has been in the past. And in the interviews, what many of the transmission companies actually said was that the sort of visibility and the window as to what's happening is actually shortening. So it's harder to sort of plan ahead, although everybody can sort of paint the picture of what this sort of future energy system would look like with predominantly renewables and all kinds of flexibility provision included. The route to get there is actually pretty difficult to predict, given all the sort of intermittent sources that come onto the grid. So reliability is something that's sort of closely linked to sort of predictability, and that's one of the things that really came out in terms of recommendations to sort of improve the ability of these players to sort of predict what's going to happen in the short term, medium term, and long term. But we do certainly see that there's increased pressure on resilience and making sure that the lights stay on. And I think the actual COVID crisis actually demonstrated how strong these players are doing this. And if anything, sort of a sense of pride to be able to work in this industry and to see how these utilities have coped when demand has fallen away and you have a large sort of intermittent production base. So I think the conclusion that we drew was that this is going to become increasingly important. And what all the companies also said was it's becoming increasingly important to interact and to coordinate with others, other transmission companies and other players in the energy system to help them manage and balance the grid. So let me just stop there, Mark.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate your comments. I might turn to Mr. Kuhlmann, perhaps to provide some comments from your point of view on that same set of challenges. Andres, I think you might be on mute there, Andres.
Sorry. Everything what has been said is true in all dimensions where we are located here in South America. Only a few words to South America or Chile, where we are located, is that in terms of renewables, solar and wind, mainly solar, Chile is a champion in potential solar generation over here. And the problem is, because of the shape of our country, it is on top of this. We are a very, very long and narrow country. It's like a spaghetti at the bottom of the world. The integration or the grid is something very difficult to integrate. And resilience is a big challenge in our country. Only that you have an idea. All solar generation is approximately 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers north of the capital where the real consumption is. And wind is far south, another 1,500 kilometers south. That means at night, between night and day, you have a swing of up to 15,000 megawatts to transport from north to south and the opposite direction in wind. That means this challenge, what is described, is a very huge challenge, and the time window is very short because this type of energy is planned and constructed in, I don't know, less than 2 years. That means all these challenges are absolutely true, and the trend is going to increase this. That means reliability is one of our top 2 or top 3 priorities in terms of operational challenges. We, as you said, TSOs are made for crisis or made for resilience. That means, yes, we are dealing with these challenges today, but I have to say it is growing, and the trend is growing every day. Another thing that perhaps in our reality is a little bit different, that we are a developing country. That means the grid is fairly new, and the demand out of the COVID situation. Now we had a demand shock, but it's still we had a growing demand. That means approximately 5% per year. What nowadays it's very important. That means the grid is not mature. That is still a lot to do, and the transition from fossil fuels to renewables, it's happening in a very rapid pace, but it's still very immature. That means, at least in our situation, and this is not only for Chile, it's all South America, I would say, it's still a coupling between these challenges, the operational challenges, on top of the development of the natural development of the grid.
Thanks, Andres. Ahmed, would love to hear some of your thoughts on this this major topic of reliability in this this new energy world of ours.
Thank you, Mark. Well, the GCC Grid was basically built for security and reliability of the GCC countries. Now, this is a backbone that connects the 6 GCC country grids. We're talking about a combined system of 120 gigawatts. The grid for the last decade has shown that it's very effective in providing this kind of security and reliability. But now we're coming into this new era where there's a big change. Renewables are coming in, and in our area, we see large targets of developing renewables, especially when you talk about Saudi Arabia, UAE, and other countries. There are very high targets of developing renewables and integrating them into the grid in the next decade. Now we might be reaching 20, 30, even 50% as per the targets. Very big targets to achieve. But that puts a challenge for us. How do we deal with that as grid operators? How do we integrate these? And because this kind of increased level of renewables will definitely affect our grid in terms of inertia, in terms of what kind of storage do we have to talk about. And these are questions that we really have to answer before we are right in the middle of this kind of big percentage of renewables. And these are the subjects we have to deal with. How do we integrate these kind of renewables, especially that the type that we have, it's basically grid scale renewables that are coming in hundreds of megawatts, and soon enough I think we'll be having solar farms at maybe 1.5 or 2 gigawatts. And how do we deal with the kind of the intermittency of these? These kind of questions are something that we must have solutions for. We have to address it. We have to, from now, plan on how to integrate it. We are in the GCC IA doing studies on what kind of guidelines we should have, what kind of changes. But I think we should have more focus on what kind of storage we have. We should have to have enough storage to accommodate this kind of high level of renewables. One of the things, what kind of technologies is hydrogen storage sufficient for us, because we are trying to, we will need really big volumes of storage. And in terms of inertia, what kind of technologies do we have to have in our systems? Because we don't want to have something like what happened in other places where the high level of renewables have really affected inertia. So big disturbances are really affecting the reliability. So the future is bright, but these kind of challenges for the TSOs have to be handled. These are not classical challenges. This is a new era that we're going into. We have to capitalize on the new technologies, the new knowledge that's there in the world, to be able to still meet our role and have more reliable grids for the future.
Great, thanks, Ahmed. Fantastic comments. And Chris, maybe some reflection from yourself on this topic of reliability and the challenges in this new energy era.
Yeah, so thank you for that. In Europe, what we see happening is that in a first instance, what we have done and what we still are doing is working on the infrastructure and adapting them to that new reality. So we come from an infrastructure that was built around thermal plants and then going to distribution centers, which were relatively close to the production sites, to a system which is more and more dependent from offshore wind and from remote, let's say, large-scale renewable plants. And so we have to bring that then to the larger demand centers. And as well, we need to have a larger geography to balance that out. So that was the first wave, and we're still in the middle of that wave. And most TSOs in Europe have massive capex programs to build, for instance, in Germany, north-south connections between the wind production in the Baltic and the North Sea towards the demand centers in the Ruhrgebiet and in the area of Bayern, where we before had thermal plants, nuclear and lignite plants. Now, the second thing that we see coming in, on which we're working, is about the fact that the thermal plants, the flexible thermal plants, are systematically now moving out of the system. And so we need to go look for new sources of flexibility to balance it out. So as long as you still have a substantial amount of thermal plants in it, let's say that inertia and flexibility are not such a big issue, because you can compensate that by the flexibility of those plants. But once that you start to move them out, you need to really start to look at the demand side, what you can do, and you need to see at the side of technology as well, how you can make sure that you can create that inertia again. And so what we're doing now is, in the first wave, we looked at the industrial flexibility. How can we activate industrial flexibility, mainly by market signals and ensuring that the market allows that they participate. And the next wave that will come is then to go into the retail market, where more and more flexibility is installed as we speak, coming from electric mobility, coming from electrified heating. So those things will create the future flexibilities that we need. But of course, then you're talking about an extremely granular market. And so you have to think about digitalization to ensure that those can participate and that they can directly link into the power market. That are now the steps that we are, let's say, today into a testing phase, and that we hope then to scale up by the middle of this decade to ensure that we can support the further rollout of renewables throughout Europe.
Fantastic. Thanks, Chris, and thanks, gentlemen, for all of those comments. Look, I wonder, and Paul touched on it, and each of you sort of touched on it, I think, through your comments. You know, COVID-19 and economic shutdowns and the like have taken us all by surprise, and obviously we're sort of 3 or 4 months in, depending on which part of the world you're in. Would love to hear your reflections on pleasant or otherwise surprises on managing reliability through the sort of the changes in activity over the last few months. We've obviously seen lower demand on the grids in most parts of the world, and economies are starting to scale up. We're seeing that increasing now. But as we've had sort of the massive drop off in load back in February and March, you know, what were your surprises, pleasant or otherwise, from the grid and from reliability issues you might have experienced? Maybe start with you, Andres.
Okay. Well, I can speak about Chile, the country where we are operating, but we are operating in a neighbor country in Peru. And I would say, well, now I have to say we in Chile and in Peru, we are in the middle of the peak of the COVID right now, and not back in February, okay? We are approximately 3 to 4 weeks behind Europe. I would say the two countries, and in general in South America, there has been very different reaction to the COVID situation. We have been very lucky in Chile because in terms of energy consumption, obviously you have the retail, the residential consumption, what stays approximately flat. But in terms of the industrial situation, Chile, the same as Peru, is heavily concentrating on mining. Mining is responsible for a big part of the electricity consumption in our countries. In the case of Chile, the mining sector were capable not to shut down, to resist the crisis, and to even go through the crisis, obviously impacted, but in terms of production, very flat. That means in Chile, we have had not more than 5% drop in demand, what is fairly low. In the case of Peru, for example, a very similar country in terms of production, etc., but socially very different, the mining sector were very, very impacted. It means they had a drop to up to over 30% of the demand of electricity. You can imagine what this means. Not only because not only analyzing the financial situation of the sector, but the operational complication this has, because the dispatch is absolutely different in both situations. That means in both countries we had very different reactions, and I would say the biggest challenge we had to overcome because of our geography is the logistics, the connection, the connectivity. But I want to add that at the same time, it has been a big challenge, but it has been a huge opportunity for innovation and for doing things different. I underline that our companies, the TSOs, are companies made for crisis management. They have the response plans in their DNA. But to give you an example, even we are having this webinar by this kind of platform remote work. But what has been, for example, our virtual reality work in terms of acting remotely on the field has been a fantastic opportunity. That means, yes, we have been impacted, but we see this as a huge opportunity for the future.
Great, thanks, Andres. And Ahmed and Chris, maybe just some quick comments from yourselves on pleasant surprises or otherwise through the sort of the shutdown on reliability and how your businesses have responded. Ahmed, maybe start with you.
Yeah, okay. I think the biggest concern that we had was load uncertainty, because with this kind of thing, load forecasting has become difficult for us because we really don't know whether we will have lower demands or higher demands. And this puts on a little bit of pressure. For the past 3 months, we had, in general, in all the 6 countries, in general, we had lower than usual demand. Maybe it was because of the nice weather that we have, relatively nice weather, not like Europe, but it was lower temperatures, and maybe that was the reason. But now, as we come into the summer, as you know, our peak in this region comes into the summer, this puts lots of uncertainty on the load. Are we going to have very high loads? Because what happens usually is during the summer, people travel away, whether people who are working in this region or local people, they go for vacations. And since air conditioning is a major factor in our loads, it's about 60 or 70%. This has a big effect. But if there's no travel during the summer, then that really puts a big question whether we will be having historical peak demands this year or not. So that kind of load uncertainty will have to deal with it. I think the overall this kind of crisis have tested the business agility. Are we really having? Are we really set up for this kind of contingency? I think working from home and working from outside of the offices, how do we maintain field operations during this kind of curfews? You have to have people going to stations to do essential maintenance or attending to calls and things like that. So these kind of things have really tested the agility of our business. And you know, I think digitalization, if it's a concept that has been really implemented and followed, it helped a lot for us in the GCC, because we already designed our processes to be more of a mobile and virtual. We didn't have much issues to deal with that. Our business went almost as good as we are in the offices. It's only about the load uncertainty that's an issue that we have to deal with.
Fantastic, thanks, Ahmed. And Chris, maybe it's just a few comments from you on sort of the shutdown in Europe and how that's impacted on reliability and some of the challenges you raised earlier.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I think it was a positive surprise to us that in the middle of such a intense crisis that you saw that we were extremely resilient as a sector. So I'm not talking only about India, but all TSOs together. First of all, I think that all the TSOs have crisis teams which are well trained, which do these exercises on a regular basis. And what you see that even in the middle of that crisis, those people actually are very, very quickly ready and see the challenges that they have to address and have their priority list ready to ensure that we keep the lights on, that the most important works are done in a safe environment, and that we then start to see what the longer term impacts are. Those things basically are happening in a very short period of time if I would compare it to other sectors that are less trained in this kind of environment. Second thing is huge solidarity between the different TSOs. Within 2 days, I think that we had calls on all levels, technical teams talking to each other, but also the CEOs talking to each other and comparing notes. How is it happening with you? What are you doing with this? How do you tackle this kind of thing? And so we maintain that permanent dialogue in a way that we basically have common policies, that common ways of working, always a little bit adjusted to the local circumstances and taking into account the instructions that we get from government, what we can do, what we cannot do, so that people can work in a safe environment. But I think that the fluidity of the information exchange that we have was impressive in my opinion, and it came spontaneously. It was not something where we had to say, oh, we start to face issues, now we talk. No, it was about, this is a big crisis, how do we manage this all together? Within 2 days, basically, we had actually very, very robust plans and a lot of interaction between teams, not only within the company, but also within the different TSOs to ensure that we could tackle this crisis in the best way possible.
Fantastic. Thanks, Chris. And I think that's probably certainly one of my reflections, and I know of Jeroen's and Paul's and others in the PwC network, is as you say, the solidarity of the TSO sector, but then broadly the power sector, and pulling together through what's been a pretty challenging 2020 so far. I might turn to the second topic, then I'm very conscious of time as well. The second topic that was flagged in the poll was long-term planning and working with new actors. And so you've sort of touched on this a little bit, a number of you with your comments already. And I can sort of see the challenge, as you mentioned just a few minutes ago, I mean, around sort of the uncertainty around forecasting load, etc. And obviously we're talking about long-term investments here of, 20, 30, 40 plus years when we're talking about transmission assets. How do we sort of reconcile that challenge of uncertainty in the short term and an energy system in transition, and then long-term investments? Again, I might just start with Paul to give us some reflections out of the interviews, maybe for a couple of minutes, on this topic of long-term planning and working with new actors.
Yep, thanks, Mark. Yeah, so I think what most of the companies, or actually all of the players in the interviews that we had, are saying is that in this energy transition, there's a leading role for transmission to really bring all that new renewable, low carbon power into the load centers that we have, and that requires building massive new networks. And I think Mr. Peters already referred to the sort of large investments that are happening, certainly in Germany, but elsewhere as well, where there's significant transmission infrastructure build being done, but that's something that's, I think, happening in other places around the world as well. And that means that the transmission companies are actually becoming more prominent and more visible, which means that they have to play a different role in the ecosystems where they operate in. And whereas in the past, the focus was predominantly on making sure that the grid is reliable, that the lights really stay on, you see a number of these transmission companies really starting to play a leading role in actually driving the energy transition. And operating differently within the ecosystem, and saying, hey, we can act as a sort of neutral, objective party and help drive this and bring together all these different players. And I think that's a great role for these companies to play, but it also means that they need to build new skill sets in order to be able to build those partnerships to really think about what is the long-term interest of the energy system. What does that then mean? So it's actually quite an exciting time for, I think, working in transmission, because it's not only about really high-level hardcore engineering and trying to solve the energy transition from a sort of physical energy perspective, but it's also about building all these relationships across the whole value chain. And I think, as Mr. Peters nicely said, also working together as colleagues and really building that trust. So that's the one thing that really, for me, came out very clearly out of our study, that there's a strong need to do this and also a strong willingness to do this, Mark.
Great, thanks, Paul. And I'm conscious we've only got about 10 minutes left, so I might move to the questions shortly, but maybe just quickly on this topic of long-term planning and working with new actors. Andres, just maybe just 1 minute on that, just sort of your immediate thoughts on that topic.
Well, it is said in the document you're releasing. It is a absolute change in what we understand by planning. Planning was always long-term, very long horizons, very certain situation between demand and supply. This has changed absolutely, and we are not transiting anymore. We are using scenario planning in our environment. This is absolutely needed. And the scenario planning could be right or wrong, but I would say, at least what I'm seeing is in the energy transmission we are living, it's absolutely inevitable that we have to overspend some money, because in scenario planning you cannot be as economic efficient as in certain situations. But fortunately, with the change to renewables, the energy price, the energy final price is dropping dramatically. That means we have some room to overinvest. But this is a cultural change in regulators, because regulators have to make this change mentally in order to allow and to understand and to really take this as an opportunity to react more quickly. Because what we are seeing in our business, to react, it has to be very quickly, unless you are always late for the renewable off-takers that really needs transmission to really act. My message is this: to really take this as an opportunity, but the big challenge for regulators is to act quickly and really change from purely economic scenarios to more probabilistic scenarios.
Right.
In
Thanks,
1 minute.
Look, I think well done. I'm very impressed. I managed to get a lot over in that minute, so thank you for that. Look, I might then just move to a couple of questions, and again, just conscious that we've only got a few minutes left. And I might just then direct these to panelists so that we can try and get some quick responses to these questions. I was really reticent to pause on your comments earlier because they were so excellent on those earlier topics. Chris, I wonder, can you maybe comment on sort of the concept of sector coupling? We've got a great question here. From a power TSO's point of view, what's the role that current gas infrastructure could play in the future to support power grids?
It's a very relevant question, but it's also for us a relatively long-term question. So if you look at sector coupling, the sector coupling that we see coming and that we're facing today is first the one of mobility and then the one of heating, and only after that the one of the gas sector coupling will come into play. And that has to do with the fact that today already we integrate, for instance, in 50 Hertz, more than 60% renewables compared to consumption without any green molecules. So overall, the green molecules that we will need are actually at the margin. So they're there for the adequacy during cold spells. They are there for the last flexibility that we will need when all the thermal plants go out. But it's not there that the focus will be on that sector coupling. So we strongly believe in green molecules, but we think that we are not the first sector they should look at. They should first look at cement, steel, and all these kind of sectors. And we should first work on electrification, because the cycle efficiency that we see of hydrogen, for instance, is relatively low. From a renewable electron to hydrogen back to an electron, you've lost 2/3 of your energy, which is, of course, compared to battery storage, compared to pump hydro stations, etc., not that an efficient cycle. And so we first will have to face, as much as we can, the challenges of electrical mobility and heating. And then, of course, obviously, then the whole sector integration will come. But important questions already need to be addressed today, which have to do with where will you put your hydrolyzers if you're dependent on far remote renewable production centers. Is that going to be right away transformed? Are we going to bring it to the shore? Are we going to bring it until the industrial client? That is not yet very clear what is the most efficient way to work on that. And I think that we need to work together, both gas and the electricity sector, to find solutions in the specific situation, because it can be, of course, different depending on the geographical setup that you have. And so we should start to think together with those sectors to ensure that we deliver, in the best interest of society, the infrastructure solutions of the future.
Fantastic, thanks, Chris. And then I might just have one last question before I hand back to Angela to summarise and close. And I might just pose this question to Ahmed. Can we please discuss the importance of distribution and transmission businesses and how they should cooperate in the management of the grid? We talked a lot about the TSOs working together, but maybe some comments on the importance of DSOs and TSOs working together.
I think this is a very important question. The cooperation between TSOs and DSOs is very important for the new era. DSOs will not be operating the same classical way, and we need this kind of cooperation and exchange of information, especially if you're having behind the meters the renewables. Load forecasting is a very tricky issue in the future for TSOs, and this kind of cooperation is very important in the future. In our region, there is more focus maybe on the grid level, renewables. But in the future, I think we're having more and more on the distribution or behind the meter. So I think this kind of collaboration and cooperation between the TSOs and DSOs is very important issue to be addressed in the new era.
Fantastic, thanks, Ahmed. And before I pass to Angela, can I thank Paul, Andreas, Ahmed, and Chris for your comments and the answering of the questions through this panel. I appreciate your time and energy you put into this session, gentlemen. Thank you. And with that, I'll pass to Angela to summarise and close.
Thank you very much. So, a fascinating dip into the future of the grid from the perspective of all the transmission system operators that were part of this study. And I'd like to thank our innovation partners, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and also those who participated in the event today. I think some of the takeaways are that the 5 challenges and 4 recommendations that come out of this report resonate strongly with the transmission system operators. We've heard a lot about reliability challenges as we increasingly put a greater amount of renewables into the power revolution globally, and also about the need to be futures fit and to think about future planning, which is no longer about just short versus long term, but increasingly about flexibility and also greater cooperation, not just across the value chain of electricity, but also between molecule players as well as electron players. And I think everybody has reflected on how Covid-19 crisis has produced a stress test on the transmission system, and the transmission system operators have responded confidently with the bold statement that they are designed for resilience. They are the resilience players, so they are our flexible friends as we move into a new and different energy future, and they seem to be the flexible friends who are looking to increase their flexibility and their friendship as they move forward. With that, I'd like to thank everybody for participating and close this webinar. The future of the grid, the future of transmission system operators are an essential part of a world which is going to have greater need and uses for electrification and greater need for a more flexible grid system. Thank you very much, everybody.